The biggest mistake that people make when trying to read philosophy for the first time is assuming that they have to start at the beginning, right?
Yeah, we tend to think that it's kind of like a university syllabus. So we need to start with Plato and then Aristotle and then move through, 2000 years of history chronologically. But if we are trying to really understand philosophy, especially outside the classroom, we are almost certain to drop this high intention of reading philosophy by maybe day three.
But why do we tend to do that? Why is it that our instinct is always to start in certain places with certain philosophers? Say like the Greeks, for example. We tend to generally start with the Greeks. Why is that?
Yeah, I think the tendency to go with the chronology, and it has certain benefits,
Of
is
course.
it comes from our desire for having a neat linear progression. But actually, that is very helpful if we are trying to understand the history of philosophy, but not philosophy. So philosophy is all about, messy, ongoing arguments, and philosophers are arguing with each other across space and time. So chronology is often not helpful at all. So, in this episode, we are going to give you 10 books to help really enter the philosophical arguments. And we will show you many doors to which to enter philosophy as a discipline, especially some of the back doors.
Yeah, but before all that, welcome to Anti-Clockwise. I am Ashmita and this is Shubhendu, and we talk about philosophy and literature on this channel. So today we are going to explain how being violently thrown into 20th century French theory might in some ways be the fastest and the most effective way to understand, say, for example, ancient Greeks, right?
Okay, so let us first acknowledge at the beginning that both of us are literary scholars by training. We are finishing our PhDs in literature departments. So when you come from literature departments and try to read philosophy, you don't read philosophy at first. You read what the academy calls theory, and there are distinct, I think, advantages as well as disadvantages to that approach.
Yeah, so let's say that you read French philosophers like Foucault or Derrida strictly as a way to decode a novel. So you use these theories to solve a literary problem. You also sometimes read these things on the side and you get influenced and you
Yeah.
decode your life problems with these philosophies, right? So you don't necessarily need to start at the beginning or with specific philosophers, but what you read, you use that to solve problems. It has its advantages, but I would say that I also faced some problems working
Yeah.
this way because you're kind of like thrown right in the middle of things
Mm.
without any prior vocabulary
Yeah.
of philosophy, right?
Mhm.
So, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the vocabulary problem is real because when philosophers are using specific words like subjectivity or will, they are heavily loaded and encoded by the tradition from which they are coming from. So let me tell you like a story about what the problem I faced during my masters. When I had this course on Sophocles' Antigone, which is this classical Greek tragedy, and then the professor was teaching us the literary and philosophical afterlives of Antigone. So we had readings from Hegel, from Kierkegaard, from the 20th century feminist philosopher Judith Butler. So from different points of time.
So different centuries, people, philosophers in different centuries talking about a Greek play, right?
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and that helped me understand that philosophy is more about arguments, and those arguments happen across space and time rather than about strictly following a chronology. So it kind of shattered my brain because I was reading so many different highly loaded arguments, but it was also in retrospect kind of helpful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is at the same time both hilarious and terrifying, right?
Yeah.
You were reading, for example, I believe you would have read Judith
Mhm.
Butler's Antigone's Claim.
Yeah,
So
exactly. That's
she's like a feminist 20th century philosopher, and the claims they challenge traditional ideas like and patriarchy, psychoanalytic structures of kinship and family, and all this you're doing before you have gone into the depths with someone like Hegel, for example, a philosopher who is very fundamental to the claims that
They are making.
Butler is making, right?
Yeah.
So you are reading a kind of a conversation, but you do not know very well what one of the people in the conversation are arguing.
Yes. But actually, it gets worse as well as more interesting, because he then also had some parts of the syllabus where on Alexander Koyev's lectures on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So Alexander Koyev is this great, French Hegelian who influenced post-structural theorists like Foucault, post-structural philosophers like Foucault. So that was kind of the quilting point, the connecting dot, that why at all, and then later, when Butler is writing, he is also going back to that tradition. They're also going back to that tradition. So all these points got connected through Koyev.
Yeah, so it was like you were stepping in the middle of a kind of historical screaming match, right?
Yeah.
Without knowing who
Yes.
started the fight. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was kind of, like reading 19th century philosophers' interpretation of ancient Greek play, which then influenced 20th century French post-structuralism. So, but that, when I was reading that, then I started understanding that, okay, these are some fundamental argumentative connections rather than, chronological connections that connect all these texts across centuries, So, yeah, I was completely lost, and honestly, I feel that it could have been done, with more step by step approach. But I'm also grateful to the professor for throwing us into this lake before we knew how to swim. So it helped
Yeah.
us kind of
So it's
understand what.
basically a different approach, right? Some people
Yeah.
would swear by this approach of throwing a child in the water to like enable them to swim, and then
Yeah.
there are others who would go step by step, like the basics first, move your feet and so on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I do think that we need to read philosophy rather than, history of philosophy a lot, because reading the guide to swimming does not help us
Yeah,
in
yeah.
swimming.
Okay, so first things first, what is our approach?
Yeah, I think let's have kind of a mixed approach, some scaffolding of where the philosophers are coming from. That is very helpful, but also we need certain texts that actually talk about the arguments. So today we'll present you a set of books that does not entirely throw you into a cold lake and does not keep you in the kiddie pool for years.
Yeah. So let's be clear at the very onset that we through today's list uses the Western canon, which is obviously really just one wing of a very large global mansion. But we already have separate dedicated episodes for Asian philosophy, African philosophy, and so on, and we will keep doing that in the future.
Yeah.
But for now, let's just focus on Western tradition.
Yeah, and we tend to mix them a lot. So there is an episode connecting by the French philosopher Bertrand and the ancient Indian philosopher Patanjali, for instance, if you want to check out. So let's start with, sort of a scaffolding, because I myself found this while, getting lost in this specific course. And the book that really helped me get out of the cold water to the shore is Will Durant's the story of philosophy. And Durant was a major professor of philosophy in the 20th century, and he's really a master of making intellectual history or history of philosophy feel like sort of a high stake drama. So you understand that philosophers are these flesh and blood humans who have specific lives, backgrounds, identities, and they are actively invested in these arguments. They are almost sort of bleeding, and they're feeling those arguments, rather than, philosophy just remaining this cut and dry abstract form of knowledge.
Yeah. Durant is great. It's not a history of philosophy book. It is more like an insight into a broad conversation of sorts. But I feel that he can still be a little heavy for a beginner.
Yeah, it's a hefty book.
So if someone comes to my office, a student comes to my office seeming completely overwhelmed, then I would probably give them Jostein Gaarder's Sophie's World.
Yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah,
a
it's a
novel,
novel.
right? Yes. So, there are academic purists who will think that, like, they will roll
Yeah, they
their
will roll
eyes.
their eyes like, oh.
But I think, yeah, that book is really helpful.
Yeah. But that's okay. Let them roll their eyes.
Yeah.
I think it's an incredibly charming and a highly effective Trojan horse, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It teaches the entire history of Western philosophy through a kind of mystery. It's about a teenage girl. It's a mystery. It completely removes, academic intimidation. And you need to feel welcome in any task before you feel like you want to get rigorous with it, right? So that's what I think this book achieves.
Yeah, I think Sophie's world is very helpful because it has this specific protagonist with whom one can identify and so on. But it still uses a basic sense of chronology. But what if a reader, does not care about the historical timeline at all, and they need a more, kind of a grown-ups introduction to philosophy? What book would you suggest?
Yeah, then I would let them skip the history entirely and look at the raw mechanics of how to think. That's what really counts, right? So I would say Simon Blackburn's Think. The name of the book is Think, and it is brilliant for this. I think it's like a thematic introduction. So he goes through the core human problems like knowledge, free will, mind, and it teaches you sort of how to read sideways into philosophy. So the conversational style that we were talking about, right? And also across centuries.
Yeah. I love that book. Yeah, and I would, strongly urge you to pair Blackburn's Think with Bertrand Russell's The Problem of Philosophy. I love Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy as well. Russell, being a philosopher, has very strong, opinions, very strong preferences for specific philosophers. So he's by no means a very objective reader, which I don't think is possible anyway. But he has this crisp, surgical clarity, and it really helps us understand the stakes of philosophy through the fog. And the Problems of Philosophy is also a very short book, so it really can, make us think. It can make us sit with the problem, and Russell can almost kind of hold us by the collar and say that forget about that, this is happening in 1600s or whatever. Look at this argument in front of you, and what do you actually think about it? So we are really forced to engage with that.
But then you also have to sometimes read philosophers in their own words, right?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Russell is a philosopher, but largely we have been talking about sort of secondary text approaches to philosophy. So when we talk of primary texts like hardcore philosophy texts, do you have an idea where to begin?
Yeah, I think the ultimate starting point is somehow again Plato. So I was this botany of not read chronologically, but I think Plato reads very well, and we can really get into the problems of philosophy through Plato. And my ultimate starting point would be Plato's Symposium.
Yeah, Plato can be fun.
Yes, Plato can be super fun. So we tend to think that ancient Greek philosophy is, this dry men in togas or whatever giving boring, serious lectures. But in Symposium, we literally see a group of brilliant, deeply flawed, slightly intoxicated Athenians at a dinner party. And there they are seriously arguing about the nature of love and desire. And Plato has these really short dialogues like Phaedo and Phaedrus, which can also work well. And then he has these longer books like Republic. I think Symposium is right in the middle, and it's a really, really great introduction to philosophy.
Yeah, and right at the climax, there is this highly drunk Alcibiades. He crashes the party to confess his unrequited love for Socrates. It is so fun. My students really enjoyed this text. It is deeply human and full of drama and tension, and it is surprisingly very funny.
Yes, exactly. So it's such a great intro. And then from that high drama of Athens, we take a historical jump to, another really important text, one of the kind of foundations of Western philosophy in some sense, again, to the 17th century, to a moment of terrifying isolation. And the book is Rene Descartes' Meditation on First Philosophy. And thankfully, we read that text in original, despite being in literature departments during our masters. And this is when Descartes is trying to re-establish philosophy from he's kind of cutting down all these links with tradition, and he's in this room and he's doubting everything, whether the room exists, whether he's really sitting by the fire and so on. And then by reducing everything, he finds that he has his thinking self still left. So that is where the modern philosophy begins: cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I exist.
Yes.
So I think it's a really, really important book for understanding what is at stake with philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it is definitely a masterclass in intellectualism, but also there is an implicit epistemological madness in it. Yeah, he kind of pushes himself to the absolute brink, and that's when it all comes out, right?
Yeah, I think I must say that, if you are again trying to do that sideways thing, there is a really fascinating debate between Foucault and Derrida on whether Descartes is really mad and how where that puts him as a rational agent as well. And you can find it, I think, in the appendix of Foucault's The History of Madness. So, which will again give you a sense why philosophy is so trans-temporal.
Yeah, it is so interesting. He's at the brink of madness, losing his rationality, and it is that point that he thinks of something which will be so important for like the history of Western rational philosophy, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so if Descartes is about like the architecture of reality, then our next books would be about the self. So the architecture of the self, right? The first one would be Meditations by this Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius. He's very popular these days. So you may have heard of him, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like we need to almost, rescue Marcus Aurelius from Silicon Valley tech bros, because the internet has turned Stoicism into a hustle culture, life hack, just shut up and do it and so on, for maximizing productivity. But that is actually quite a misreading.
Yeah, don't care what people are saying.
Yeah. And also don't care about your own feelings and so on, because Stoicism is all about examining them.
Yeah.
So they are actually very strongly misleading Aurelius and Stoicism.
Yeah, it completely strips the vulnerability out of it, right? And this book was never actually meant to be published. It is a private diary of a very powerful man, arguably the most powerful man in the world, and he's writing in desperation, and he quietly kind of notes to himself inside of a tent on the front lines of a war, and he's trying to figure out how to stay sane and morally grounded. And since we are talking about pairing and conversations, we would highly suggest that to pair with this, you should pick up Seneca's Letters from a Stoic. So these two together for Stoicism.
Yes, that's a great suggestion. So I love this pairing, and Seneca was also advising his friend on how to, reclaim oneself from the frantic business of Rome. So there is a sense of exhaustion which kind of strongly resonates with the exhaustion we feel in the current attention economy. And I feel like the ancients also felt it, so it's also very relatable. And if you want to go in depth with why you need to understand Stoicism in this way, a great book would be Pierre Hadot, who was also a teacher of Foucault, called Philosophy as a Way of Life. This is outside our main recommendations, but it's a great book for understanding what philosophy is all about: examining our selfhood, examining our life, rather than writing a book, rather than discursively, performatively presenting oneself in some way.
Yeah. Okay, so now we can move into the 20th century, and we need to talk about the existentialists. So these were basically thinkers who realized that the university does not come with prepackaged meaning.
As does the universe. The universe does not have any prepackaged meaning either, right?
Yeah, what did I say? University?
Yes.
Oops. Yeah.
Both of them are quite absurd in their own ways.
Yeah.
So, what would you suggest? What is the best place to start? And I also have a minor, Sartre. And I also have a minor rant that the literature departments do not teach the existentialists as much as the post-structuralists. So structured.
Really? I thought everybody loved the existentialists.
Yeah, people love them, but not so much. I don't know about your university, but yeah, I feel like, I mean, you can start if you are brave, but don't start with Sartre being a nothingness because it's so heavy, and you will start using specific terminologies like being in itself, being for itself, which will only make sense if you have read philosophers before, especially Husserl and Hegel and so on. So I think the best place to start Sartre is with his first novel, Nausea, which is about his kind of he's grappling with the absurdities of life, and there is a sense of disgust, and at the same time it's a very sensuously full narration of life. He is also experiencing all these small sensory details and connecting them with, so it's a really atmospheric, great start for what is really at stake with existentialism.
Yeah.
And you read the other book, which is an introduction. I'm forgetting the name.
Sarah Bakewell?
Yeah. Sarah
Yeah.
Bakewell's Anti-Existentialist Captain.
Yeah. It is a very brilliant atmospheric group biography. So Bakewell does something very crucial. I think she grounds the theory in physical reality. So she kind of shows you how philosophy wasn't born in sterile university environment. It was rather, at least French philosophy was born in Parisian cafes over apricot cocktails and
Or
so on.
cigarettes and
Yes.
so on. So yeah,
Cigarettes and
philosophy
coffee.
always has some kind of important drink or the
Yeah.
at its backdrop. It's
Yeah.
for the Greeks. I know it's certain kinds of alcohol, like
alcohol, yeah.
elixirs, whatever. For Hegel and others.
Yeah, they mixed wine with water.
Okay, yeah, and for this French existentialists, it's black coffee or cocktails or whatever. So, what is then our last book? What is the final book that we should read for really getting into the nooks and crevices of philosophy?
Yeah, I think our final book would be Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus.
Oh yes, I knew that you were going to read it.
Yes, I knew that too. Yeah, I think that text is very impactful.
Yes, it has that great first line, which is probably one of the greatest first lines in any philosophy book. And I'm quoting here: "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." Unquote.
No, he doesn't promote suicide.
Yes, he's just talking about how there is a certain absurdity of life. You could probably better discuss it, because I know that at some point
we can do it in another episode probably. I think it's that's the plan.
Yeah, let's have an entire episode.
And it's a very stylishly written book, so definitely,
Yes, both Camus and Sartre are very stylish.
Yeah. He looks at this absurdity of the universe, and he refuses to answer any cries for meaning. So very absurd and very impactful, very modern.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to give you a small gist, he basically takes the Greek myth of Sisyphus, the man who was condemned by the gods to roll this massive boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down again. And he keeps doing it time and time again, and he turns it into this triumphant manifesto. He argues that the struggle itself is enough to fill the human heart.
Yeah, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, right? That's what Camus says. So you do not really need an advanced degree in philosophy to read these texts. You just need to give yourself the permission and sit with it. So, until the next time, just find a philosophical problem and keep the door open to all these arguments and linger in that argument. So, until next time, stay anti-clockwise.